I'm Tasneem Essop, and this is episode 5 of Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. After South Africa's 2024 general election, the old Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, the DMRE, was split in two: the Department of Electricity and Energy and the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources. Together, they now sit at the center of South Africa's energy transition. But despite the restructuring, the challenges remain. Neither department has yet articulated a clear stance on the just transition, or used tools like the Integrated Resource Plan for open and transparent public engagement. Capacity has not kept pace with mine and power station closures. Policy on labor, community, and environmental transitions are still weak, and enforcement of mine rehabilitation remains uneven. These are not isolated failures. They reveal a deeper struggle within the post-apartheid state, a state still shaped by the minerals energy complex. In the current context, coal has now come to represent both working-class livelihoods and Black economic empowerment, while renewables are still widely perceived as dominated by white or foreign capital. To unpack this tension, we speak to PARI researchers Dr. Thokozani Chilenga-Butau and Wasim Holland, co-authors of the Transitions Report, whose work focuses on energy poverty and community engagement. Okay, so there's an important disclaimer to make in terms of the research that this episode deals with, mainly that the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, or the DMRE, was later split into two departments, the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources and the Department of Energy and Electricity, respectively. I think nonetheless, this research still kind of applies to the new circumstances. Even with the restructuring, it would seem that both of these departments have a kind of strategic role to play in the just energy transition. So maybe let's start there with how the restructuring impacts various departments and its ability to act in this strategic manner in relation to the just transition.
I think that in the early drafting of the report, one of our recommendations was actually that mineral resources and energy need to be split. And that is because energy, especially renewable energy and what the just energy transition focuses on, seem to be evolving at a much quicker pace than mineral resources. So I don't see the split as a bad thing necessarily, but it still means that the Department of Mineral Resources and Petroleum now has to be more forthright in terms of its position on mineral resources and how those are going to be managed for the just energy transition.
Sure. And I mean, we'll circle back around to this because part of the research speaks to the kinds of conflicts within departments and between departments. So we'll come back around to how the restructuring impacts some of this. So when we speak here in this episode to the DMRE's position, we are basically speaking to the current two departments and actually a range of other departments too. Would that be correct?
I think so, only because departments don't work in isolation. And even in the report, we discussed the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environmental Affairs. We discussed the Presidential Climate Commission and a whole range of actors that are involved in this sector in particular, but also in the just energy transition. For now, however, the Department of Electricity and Energy seems to be getting away lightly, to put it nicely, because their focus is on electricity. So we're yet to see how they would enter the just energy transition space. And they also need to establish themselves in terms of policy and what they think about the just energy transition.
Sure. So to bring Wasim into the interview, from the research, how would you characterize the DMRE's position on the just energy transition?
At times, we saw kind of contradictory positions around the department's position on the transition. And it's reflected in some of the utterances of the leadership in the ministry and in the department as well. So you essentially have moments where leadership is speaking to one kind of sector that will completely contradict what is said by another official, senior official, to another sector. So I think there's a number of different dimensions around how the DMRE is positioned with a just transition. But we can say clearly that often it was contradictory. And it depends on the level that we're talking about. If we're speaking about at the kind of grassroots and how the DMRE interfaces with regular people, we can certainly say that they've, in many instances, have been kind of missing. Of course, the report that we're talking about highlights a number of kind of interventions that are made by the DMRE, but we can say that it's meant to be in a kind of strong leadership position of the JET, while certainly not the only important institution that is meant to kind of make this thing work, really. Yeah.
And part of this, and this is coming back to the first kind of question that we answered, is around the conflict of interest between the different departments. And this is at the level of both policy and mandate, I think, is what I gleaned from it. Speak a bit, either one of you, about some of these conflicts of interest between different departments and how this is playing out in the implementation of the just energy transition.
So, one of the conflicts of interest is that the DMRE, as it was formerly known, is both an overseer and a regulator of mineral resources and energy, as well as an environmental regulator of mining companies and the way that they deal with either shutting down mines, sustainable development, or ensuring that there is fairness for workers at mines. They can't necessarily be judge and jury at the same time. And that's where the discussion about the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and Environmental Affairs comes in, because the expectation initially was that that department would be managing issues around sustainable development, environmental management, which is the early language of the DMRE. So just to go back a bit, the just energy transition has a long history, especially with trade unions. But in terms of policy direction and mandate, the DMRE was initially supposed to be the department that ensures sustainable development and environmental management through the Mineral Resources and Petroleum Development Act and other legislation that came along. It appears, though, that it has not taken up that role as fully as it should, compared to the way that it regulates mines and, would provide mining permits, etc. And now the just energy transition is forcing that department to try to figure out what it should be doing, how it should be doing that, but also how it should be working in a good way or a sustainable way with other departments or players in the field. So there's a missed opportunity there, and as you say, a conflict between policy, mandate, and what they actually do on a daily basis.
The cautious orientation towards coal is not just about limited capacity. It is rooted in history. For more than a century, the minerals energy complex has bound the state and the economy together. Departments have been merged, split, renamed, yet their identity endures: custodians of extraction. Even today, some leaders frame the just transition as a Western imposition, a threat to sovereignty and transformation. By casting coal as the cornerstone of both energy security and economic justice, the state keeps one foot firmly in the past, even as systemic change becomes increasingly urgent. So, it seems to me that this conversation is on two levels. The one is at the level of state reform and, the actual functioning of institutions of the state. And the other appears to me to be at Wasim, you spoke earlier about a kind of political economy, and approaches to questions of political economy. And you've both, Togo and Wasim, you've both spoken to the kind of 100-year history of the department and what its initial purpose was. And then there's this, really foundational approach to understanding South African political economy, which is the minerals energy complex. And I wonder how that side of it comes into this institutional stickiness, this kind of resistance to shifting in the transition.
So I think the minerals energy complex is seen as part of the backbone of the South African economy. And as we've been discussing, we can see why. Coal mining, but mining in general, is part of our country's legacy, history, GDP, etc. But on the other hand, just as we discussed conflicts of interest, at the community level, at the business level, and all the way up, there were always conflicts of interest within the minerals energy complex, right? Where we knew that state-owned entities or ESCOM were built mainly for businesses and running an economy, but not necessarily for keeping the lights on for all of us. And now that's the purpose of energy, right? Is to say it's not just about the economy, but it's also about who has access to energy, who has access to electricity, and what that means in a state such as ours, where inclusion, people's rights, responsibilities of the state matter more than just building or creating energy supply for business. And so I'm not saying that the minerals energy complex is no longer important, but I'm saying it's becoming more complex, you know. And I'm sure in a lot of these communities, even in mining areas and mining towns, you find that no matter how close they are to the supply, they themselves still would have problems with energy and access to energy and access to electricity. I think that this came in quite late in the report in terms of the role of the minerals energy complex, but it was important to note that given the history of the MEC in our economy, in the political economy, but in our society in general, this could be one of the points that is preventing the DMRE from participating in the just energy transition in a different way. That maybe it's trying to maintain a minerals energy complex that no longer fits the context that we are in. And then you have to deal with that internal conflict first before trying to deal with why is it not stepping up to the just energy transition. And this is why the report was called Transitions, because the question was, how does the DMRE transition internally to then participate in the just energy transition, however it will step up to do that, right? So even if it says, look, our responsibility is to regulate differently or to oversee differently and nothing more, until there's no coal left in the ground, that is still a strong policy position compared to now, where a lot of stakeholders are saying the department is missing in action, right? It might not be a moral policy position, but it's a better position, and we would know why it's taking that position and what to expect from it than the silence that it is giving in community meetings, informal forums such as the PCC engagements, and even in public pronouncements, where there's this conflict between a state that needs to transition in terms of energy, but also fearing that the just energy transition is being imposed as a form of neocolonialism. You still have to work through all those arguments, but are you showing up to the table to work through those arguments? That's what, our report was trying to address in the later parts.
Coal's weight still anchors South Africa's development story. The DMPR frames mining as empowerment. The DEE frames renewables as innovation. But in practice, the two are locked in the same house, pulling in opposite directions. The tension runs through mandates and budgets. Each department is expected to enforce environmental law while simultaneously depending on extraction for revenue. The result? Overlapping duties, blurred accountability, and a culture of caution. Institutional weakness breeds mistrust, and while policy gridlock unfolds in Pretoria, the real costs are felt elsewhere, in communities waiting for clarity, support, and direction. Is there resistance to change in the department? And If your answer is yes, or nuanced, because likely to be nuanced, what kind of political and economic interests are shaping that resistance?
One of the big issues we obviously had to deal with that kept getting raised was the question around the kind of injustice or redress imbalances of like capital, mining capital, and the issue around where you have an area that is traditionally based around coal mining, that coal mining actually penetrates every aspect of social life in these places. It's coal mining that formed the town, it's coal mining that empowers the area. And then at the same time, you asked to kind of scale down these things, but you also have a strong kind of lobby relating to the questions around redressing the blockages that were created by apartheid in terms of kind of a black capitalist mining class. You have, in terms of like the demergers of Anglo American and all the other big mining firms, and you have these startups that basically represent, in a lot of ways, the aspirations around, the expansion of the capitalist class, for example. I mean, it becomes then a kind of conflict of how do you actually scale down and phase down on two dimensions about like grassroots people who depend on coal, and then also the kind of elites who are being asked to be representatives of, a new developmental project. I think that's really important. And it comes out in a lot of ways around. We saw it when we were in Pumalanga around, like, for example, people's lives are dominated by coal, as you mentioned. But you also then have all these mining capital, smaller companies, but still major players who will be like stepping in terms of their social interventions around when people sometimes they help people when they don't have money, or they provide important lifelines for people that are struggling in these places. So it becomes then a problem for the department to how do you balance all these kind of contradictory demands. The invisibility of government in these places, especially in times of crisis like this, where major change seems to be on the horizon, but they're not informed. People don't really know what's going on. And, you have places where these minerals are so dominant, it's so central to people's lives. And then these mining companies, not only were they kind of part of the formation of these towns, but they also, as I said earlier, they kind of step in at moments when the state fails. And so it becomes a situation where people identify like failure with the state. And I mean, this is not to absolve mining companies. I mean, they, in a lot of ways, cause the problems in many instances. But in terms of how people perceive these dynamics, they associate like assistance, not with the state, but with the mining companies. So, in terms of like when we were speaking to people on the ground, the government is it's never there. The DMRE, you'll ask them directly. We know DMRE do a lot of work. We know that there's a lot of stuff happening, but they don't see that. Even with some of the things that like Toko and I saw, you hear from people that attend meetings and they'll say like, when there are public forums like city hall meetings, town hall meetings, rather, sometimes government, especially the DMRE, they may send the wrong person. They'll send people who don't sometimes know what's going on. They'll send like people who have expertise in one sector, but then they'll ask them to attend meetings regarding another. And it might not be the case that the state is doing nothing, but in terms of how people perceive it, it becomes a problem.
I just wanted to add to that. This issue of mining companies and mining towns reminds me of work that PARI did in Lephalale and Mogalakwena, where mining towns were historically established because mining companies went there to break ground and then urbanized or built up that area for profit and for their convenience. And now what we're seeing is a continuation of that legacy in, one form or another, where a state-owned entity or even, the DMRE and other players, government departments and institutions, are not thinking about what they should be doing to develop those areas beyond people's dependence on energy and mineral resources. And now that the just energy transition is bringing up all these conflicts at different levels, be it community, SMMEs, larger provinces, and the state in general, we're left asking, what is the role of the state in these communities? Similar to legacy mining towns, where effectively they had to hand over not only resources, but in some cases political leadership, because they had been leading those towns, right? And that is a dangerous situation where, as Wasim and Mahlatsi are saying, the state appears to be absent. It's a dangerous situation because there's mistrust within the community, there's lack of accountability, but also there is no plan to ensure that however this transition happens, if it happens, when it happens, then people are protected. And that's what really matters in the energy transition, is that are people going to be protected? Their livelihoods, their families. We don't want a different legacy playing out of forced removals, which we know is happening at some scale, right? And so we have to make sure that in the just energy transition, with all these conflicts that are happening at different levels, we do hold the DMRE and different institutions accountable. One participant actually in our research said, look, the just transition and people's livelihoods and mine workers and other industries dependent on the energy industry is not a job for the DMRE. It is a job for the state, whatever that means, whether it's Department of Labor, Department of Small Business and Enterprise, National Treasury. They need to have a holistic development plan that is going to assist these communities with the just energy transition. And when they said that, I thought it was quite callous to say, well, it's not the DMRE's job to figure this stuff out. But the more that we do field work, whether it's on the ground or with the DMRE, we're starting to realize that it's true. There has to be some sort of transition plan, development plan. Essentially, that's missing. Whether you want to mine right to the center of the earth or whether you want to, transition energy, you still need a sustainable plan. And that's where people then look to the DMRE to say, what is your role in this as one of the key players?
And the question that kind of strikes me from everything that you all have been saying is, how are coal-affected communities navigating this moment? And it seems to me with very little guidance from departments or from official, kind of platforms.
People don't give up. They've had to face difficulties and find ways of dealing with these things, and it's difficult to kind of witness this. I think that people have had to make choices around like how to continue their lives and that kind of thing, and they just make do with what they can.
So one of the things that's pointed to in the research is this idea of institutional stickiness in relation to the DMRE. Explain to us a bit more about what this is and what its implications are.
When we started the research, we thought that, look, this is a mighty institution, one of the oldest in South Africa, in existence, from the 1800s, if I'm not wrong, and clearly a department that knows what it should be doing, but also how it should be doing that. And so not afraid to step into a more productive role within the just energy transition, only to find through our policy analysis that it had been lagging behind on certain responsibilities. We're not sure why that is. So we've already mentioned the environmental management and sustainability. Another area that the DMRE was lacking in is the closure of mines. And we've seen in the past few years how the lack of closure of mines has led to the issue around zamazamas, pollution, and problems in communities where mines should have been properly fenced off and closed or rehabilitated for one reason or another. Added to that is the issue of the department being split into Department of Mineral Resources and Department of Energy around the 2009 period. I think everyone can Google the politics around that. But what it led to internally is a lack of coherence around what the separate parts of the department were supposed to be doing, whether it's mineral resources and energy. Some of our participants alluded to skills and capacity leaving the two departments because of intimidation around policy contestation. And then when the departments were re-merged in the 2019 period, there was an imbalance of capacity where I think, Wasim, if you remember, I think they said there were more mineral resource experts and energy experts left in the department. And then those experts having to step outside their expertise to deal with energy. A bit of policy inertia because of how the integrated resource planning and all of those formal policy processes were not only contested, but were taken out of the department in some way, shape, or form. But I think on a very practical, operational, everyday level, people in the department seem to still be lost in translation about what their responsibilities in the department are. Simple things like moving between buildings has been very unsettling for a lot of the staff there. Assets being in one building and not being moved to another building, people not necessarily knowing, what their responsibilities are, not only in terms of the just energy transition, but policy formulation in general. And then a problem which I think we mentioned in the report, but I don't think we had time to get into, is whether or not the new DMRE that emerged out of 2018, 2019 actually had enough funding and resources to do its own work, but also take on the just energy transition. We all know that departments are funded by National Treasury and the national budget. But what we don't realize is that when departments are split, that doesn't mean that their budget doubles. And when they're put back together, it also doesn't mean their budget doubles, right? And so even though we were doorstopped a bit when we worked with the DMRE, I did have sympathy for I did have a bit of sympathy for the people working there because I wondered how much they were already trying to do or cope with this remerger, but fewer resources, and how then the just energy transition maybe was adding to their workload. This isn't to excuse them, but I think this is a problem in government in general. You'll never have all the resources that you need, but for the resources to keep being cut back and for the expectations to be higher and higher, especially when we face the crisis that we do around the just energy transition, I think, gave me a lot of sympathy for people working in the DMRE. But apart from that, no other sympathy.
On paper, the DMRE once led the just transition. But in practice, it is communities, activists, and researchers who have carried the work from below. Even as government stalls, people are experimenting with their own forms of transition. Grassroots cooperatives, women-led solar projects, trial-run clean energy appliances, and local NGOs reframing energy not as a commodity, but as a right. These are glimpses of what transformation could look like when justice becomes a lived process rather than a policy slogan. In the next episode, we shift perspective. If the state has been hesitant, what happens when communities, activists, and researchers carry the work forward from below? And what does the just transition look like when it is understood as systems change, not only climate change? I'm Tasneem Essop, and you've been listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. To learn more about PARI and their research, visit pari.org.za. If you found this episode useful, please like, follow, or subscribe, and share it with others, and keep listening.